Society, which owns and manages Perivale Wood. David has been recording the Lepidoptera in Perivale Wood since the early 2000s. So I will now hand you over to him for what I'm sure will be an interesting and enjoyable talk. Thank you.
Need to unmute myself, otherwise it'll be a very boring talk. Thanks, Maria. I will quickly flip into the presentation. So I'm going to turn my video off whilst I'm doing that, because it'll probably be quite confusing to have both things going on at once. Have a quick chat, we'll run through that, and then I say lots of time for questions and so on at the end. I can see a mix of people who I know and are probably very familiar with the reserve and very familiar with Lepidoptera recording, and people I don't know who might be familiar with both of those things. But I'll run through on that basis. Let me just stop the video and share my screen, which, why is that not doing what I wanted? Just a moment. Right. You could all presumably see a slideshow, and if a slideshow isn't showing, Maria or Kieran will shout at me very shortly. So hello. Maria introduced me, who I am. I've been involved with London Natural History Society and the Selborne Society since probably around 2000, 2002, something like that, and got actively involved in recording Lepidoptera at Perivale Wood, which is my local site. Recently. So I will quickly just have a chat about that and some of what we've seen. So that's basically what we're going to do. What we're going to talk about. I'll give you a brief introduction to Perivale Wood. For those of you who don't know where it is, which might be some of you, it's a pretty small nature reserve in northwest London. This is London's off to the right hand side of this image, and the red arrow is pointing at Perivale Wood. It's essentially that small green blob between the railway line and the canal. So it just gives you a bit of a sense of where it is. It's very much suburbia. It's very much surrounded by housing, accommodation, and things like that. So very much embedded in an urban environment. Just to give that bit of context as well. This is a map of the reserve itself. Probably not directly relevant to you guys for this talk, but just to give a sense of it. It's near enough to a square in shape to make it easy for me. And the habitats of the reserve. We sort of split the reserve into into a series of sort of different habitat types when we're talking about it. And one type of habitat is pastures. Pastures, meadows, whatever you want to call them, they are strictly, I understand, pastures, but there are probably better botanists than me on this who will be able to correct that. This is one of the pastures that we call the paddock. It's not the most imaginative names, but it's a paddock. It is grassland, and the yellow flowers you can see up there are a combination of creeping buttercup and yellow rattle. And until quite recently, we maintained these meadowlands, these grasslands, as habitat by a combination of grazing with horses and occasional mechanical cutting. But in recent years, we've had them hay cut much more, and this year we're exploring getting cattle in. So that's just the idea of the different habitats. Why is that not moving? The next habitat is woodland. It's around 18 acres of the site is woodland. I've probably mentioned the size of the site overall. The site overall is 27 acres, about 5 acres of those paddocks, about 18 acres of woodland. Quite famous for its display of bluebells. I've never managed to take a convincing picture of bluebells, so I took one that was deliberately artistic for this purpose. And the woodland, if you want, is an oak woodland. The main canopy species is oak. And this image here is from my friends from Nature Guides, who are some of the participants in this. I'll explain why we've got this picture later. But it's oak, but it's got other species, canopy species: ash, rowan, crabapple, field maple, wild cherry, wild So that's the sort of canopy layer. The understory, the layer below that, the sort of smaller tree layer, is dominated by hazel, with quite a bit of hawthorn, quite a bit of ivy common in there as well. And the field layer, the base layer, is bramble and bluebell predominantly. Lots of other plants, but that's if you want the predominant plants. So just to give you a sense of the habitat before we get into leps, I'll keep running through some more of the habitat. Edges and hedges, mainly because it rhymes. But the edges of the reserve are a bit different in structure, with a lot more dominance by English elm, grey willow, elder, blackthorn. Quite a few hedges, predominantly hawthorn and blackthorn structure, with other plants in there. We have a much smaller area of aquatic habitat, probably around 2 acres, consisting of broadly defined 5 ponds, a couple of wet ditches, a couple of runnels, streams, areas of wet ground. And probably common reeds, the most abundant plant in those areas, but again, there are other wet habitat specialists. And then the last thing we've referred to is another couple of acres of miscellaneous habitat. There's another talk about the structure of the site that somebody else from the society can do, but part of the site is an old Victorian rubbish dump. It means that the soil structure and the soil chemistry there is very different, and the plants are very different. This is just some random junk, glass mainly, that I found in that rubbish dump to illustrate the point. But again, that just gives a bit of a sense of the variety in this quite site habitats. Very briefly talk about the ways we survey for moths, because some people may not be familiar with what we do and how we go out and find moths, how we go out and find butterflies. Well, the most basic method is you just have a look. If I was doing this in a field meeting, I'd ask people to put their hands up when they've spotted the butterflies in the picture. They're not the most concealed, but it's not really practical in this. But you may be able to see my mouse vaguely moving over a couple of gatekeeper butterflies there. And that's the most basic method to survey for Lepidoptera. Like anything, is just get out in the field and look for stuff. And you'll definitely not see it if you don't do that. A more formal version of looking for things are what are known as the butterfly transects methods. And I'll briefly explain these. These are a more formal recording method that controls the observer effort. So the problem with just looking for things is, if I told you I went to Perivale Wood and last year I saw 500 gatekeeper butterflies, and then this year I went to Perivale Wood and I saw 50. That might tell you they've really declined, or it might tell you that last year I spent 100 hours looking and this year I spent 10. So what this method does is it sets out a fixed route, and the route is sort of shown around here on a map. It's very crudely mostly around the borders of the site, the way I've set it up. That route is walked at least once a week between April and October. You can divide within a box 2.5 meters on each side. So managing social distancing and visualizing how far to keep away from people, absolute breeze for me, because I do it all the time when I'm doing this survey. But you walk a fixed route for a fixed length of time, and you count the butterflies and the moths, if you can identify them, that you see in that route. And because that's standardized, you can much more confidently say if numbers have changed, that's probably telling you something about the population, not about how much effort I was making, or how much effort a recorder was making. And because that's a robust method, you get to do statistical analyses on it, which I know everybody comes to natural history for the statistical analyses. That's the main reason you're here, I appreciate. I won't go through lots of complicated modelling, mainly because I haven't done it, but it gives you data for each year. It lets you start run modelling techniques here. So I ran a fairly simple model here where I basically explained the populations observed through this transect of all these different butterfly species and tested each one of them to see whether there was an obvious time trend. And what it tells me is it showed slightly negative trends for 3 of the species: green-veined white, small white, and peacock. very slightly significant. Any proper statisticians will be jumping up and down at the phrase very slightly significant. You're not meant to say that, but not really strong, really strong messages. And a fairly strong positive trend for marbled white. Now, marbled white butterfly, if you can squint at your screen and see this, didn't appear on the reserve until 2011. So it's not surprising it's shown up a positive trend. And if I did the next few years on to this data up to 2019 and possibly this year, it will be even stronger because that butterfly has really expanded its population in Perivale Wood and in the naming. Another method, finding the early stages and rearing them on. So those of you familiar with Perivale Wood might remember the old toilet block, the old chemical toilets. Well, we got rid of the chemical toilets because we put proper ones in. But I commandeered the building and wouldn't let anybody knock it down, and it's now where I rear caterpillars. It doesn't smell toilety anymore, but I rear caterpillars there. I've got 4 species here. I'll not ask people to shout out what they think they are, I'll just tell you. So the egg is the egg of a speckled wood butterfly. Moving to the right, this is a caterpillar of a purple hair streak butterfly. It's an oak feeding butterfly, although I don't think it was actually on oak in this occasion. It probably dropped up. A caterpillar at the bottom left of the scalloped oak moth, feeding on bramble here by the looks of it. And finally, a pupa that I found in one of our buildings of clouded brindle. It's actually the first record of that species for the reserve, was finding a pupa and thinking, I'll keep that and see what it turns into. So looking for the early stages, and that's probably something we don't do enough of modern lepidopterists, because of some of the techniques I'm going to come to now. We do less of this, although there's some really good literature on the caterpillars of British moths British Lepidoptera just come out. So I'm hoping more and more people will do this, and I will be able to do more as well. Another traditional method is called sugaring. We have got rid of this stove now. Somebody pointed out that as a risk assessment, sticking a label on it saying danger explosive grill didn't actually make it safe. But what you do here is you boil up, you get some beer, you put some treacle in it, you put some sugar in it, and you boil it up and make it this really sticky mix, and you spread it onto a tree or a trunk of a tree or something, and moths come and drink the liquid. Sometimes if you have too much beer to make it, somebody has to drink the beer afterwards, and I know that's a hardship, but people endure. This attracted a satellite moth on this occasion. That's just what I happened to put on to show it. This is the traditional method we used to use for serving the moths. Back in the day, gentlemen would be travelling to somewhere to go serving for moths, and they'd book ahead. They'd tell the inn where they're going to make sure they had a nice meal. But if they could send some servants out to go and put the treacle on the trees first, so they could go and look for the moths on their own. I haven't got any servants, unfortunately, so I have to do this myself. This is probably the main method that people who survey for moths use these days. Light traps. A variety of boxes with different types of light bulb on the outside. Moths, I think people are fairly familiar with, tend to be attracted to light. Not all species are, but many are. So the moths fly to the light, they drop into the box below. It's designed so it's got a funnel on top, it's easy to get into, hard to get out of. So you can come back the next morning and you can see what moths you've got without having to spend the entire night out there. For those of you who are familiar with moth traps, the one on the bottom right might look a bit different. This is a design I stole from an entomologist. I borrowed his idea from Twitter. A gentleman called John Walters who suggested doing this. And this is ultraviolet emitting, light emitting diodes. The actual putting the trap together was done by one of the Selborne Society members, a chap called John Morell, who I may or may not be on this, but John very generously agreed. I said, John, could you give me some advice on how I might put this together, because you understand electronics? And he then just built one for me. And that's proved successful. So that proved an interesting alternative technique. And then another method, again, this is quite a modern method because the chemistry's only really been solved recently. That is indeed a bag from a washing powder tablets. But in it is a small plastic bung impregnated with the synthetic chemicals, sex chemicals of a female moth. And these pheromones attract male moths. They smell them and think, ooh, there's a lovely female there, I'll go and have a look at her. And that's a way that you get to see the pheromones. Now, I wrote this presentation last week, and in my notes I wrote, but sadly this method has never produced any moths in Perivale Wood. But I was there this weekend and successfully attracted a six-belted clearwing moth. Rather an odd-looking moth. For people who are not familiar with moths, this is perhaps not what you'd think of. It's a wasp mimic. It's got largely transparent wings rather than having scales on it. Very unmothy. But that absolutely made my weekend when I found that. I was absolutely delighted because I'd never seen one of this group of moths before, the clearwing moths. I'd never had success with the pheromone moth lures before. And finally, probably the most modern method that we did, and this is a bit of an experiment that we did, was working with my friends from Nature Guides again, who provided from this drone the picture we had earlier of the canopy. We were looking at some of the species that live in the canopy of woodland, and we were just interested in the question of, would this technique let you survey for moths? So, well, not for moths, for butterflies particularly, in the canopy. So we put a drone up. We spent a lot of time there. There's pictures of me standing in the middle of the paddock with a virtual reality headset on as this drone flies over and I try to see butterflies. It's in the outtakes reel for later, I suspect. And the short answer is yes, you can. This would let you spot butterflies at the canopy. It's quite inefficient compared to what we were able to survey anyway by just scanning with binoculars. So for this site, we probably won't use it as a major technique. But if I was surveying a site that was very hard to get to on foot, that was very hard to observe, if there were things in the way so you couldn't see into the canopy, this would be potentially a really useful technique that could be used elsewhere. Plus, it got us to fly a drone around, and that was fun. So a brief history of recording in the reserve, what we've done to record in the reserve. And the history of the recording I'm going to give you takes entirely the form of this graph. This graph goes up to 2017. And what it's showing you is the cumulative total of records of Lepidoptera from Perivale Wood since the first records we've been able to track down in 1961, which were some butterfly records. And I thought this just gives an illustration of nope, can't do that. This just gives an illustration of what's happened. So the first records we were able to track down, although the reserve has been a nature reserve since the back end of the 19th century, we don't seem to have many records of insects really prior to the 1960s. It was very much, it was described at the time as a bird reserve, and to some extent the recording focused on birds and plants a bit more than insects. But from 1960s, people got involved, some of whom are still involved in the society now, recording things, and a few butterflies were noted pretty quickly. And then around the mid-1960s, there was a real effort to start recording Lepidoptera. The society bought a moth trap and started running moth traps, and you can see the number of moths immediately shot up. And up to about the early 1970s into the 1970s, people were doing that recording and really discovering for the first time, even the incredibly common stuff, because it just had not been recorded before. Recording sort of continued on through the 70s, 80s and 90s at a somewhat lower level, but people were still recording, and records continued to tick up. And you can sort of see the spikes when there was perhaps a little bit more in effort. There was a kick up. Somebody obviously did a bit of work that year. And things built up. And that was a period of sort of consolidating, seeing things, continuing to add records, continuing to add more and more. And then around about 2004, I started to get involved along with a friend of mine called Andrew Culshaw. We'd got dragged into mothing, I think in part just to provide extra bodies for security purposes to help out one of Ealing's rangers who was surveying some of the sites in the local borough. And she didn't necessarily want to be out in the dark on her own. Andy and I were interested in natural history. He said, "Oh, we'll come along. This mothing thing looks amusing. It might fill the odd evening of one's life, or my entire life since." Got enthusiastic, so we both acquired our own draft and started recording in the reserve. And you can see from 2004, there's a really big spike again when we really threw some effort into it, recording throughout the year. And the other thing that goes on, I haven't really talked about the different types of moths, but the micro moths, the smaller moths, the ones that are generally harder to identify, we made a real effort to record them as well. I should say a significant amount of the ability to put this big spike in the micro moth records is due to that person I mentioned before, Rachel Terry, who was one of Ealing's rangers at the time, but is a really enthusiastic amateur in the best sense lepidopterist, and she does a lot of the difficult species for me. Most of this light green blob here, if she had not been there helping me out with those identifications, doing many of them for me, teaching me how to do some of them myself. So huge thanks to her. A fair chunk of that is due to her. But very crudely, that gives you the history of the reserve, an initial effort, a sort of consolidation period, and then a renewed survey that's been running now for about 15-ish years. And it's still going on. Moth trapping is one of the things you can do in a socially distanced way. So we have largely been able to continue during this period doing our surveying for both moths and butterflies in the reserve, which I know hasn't been the case for everyone on everyone's site. But that's just to give you a sense of where we are, and it gives you a sense of 600 and something species in total recorded over this time, which is a reasonable number. And I'll briefly try to keep my own time. Hasn't shouted at me yet, so I obviously haven't been on too long. Summary of some of the Lepidoptera fauna of the reserve. What we've got, what we can see, what's there. Here's another table. This is records up to 2015. And the reason it's records up to 2015 is that was when I last did a real sort of deep analysis and consolidation of the records for a publication that Selborne Society put out that I wrote about essentially this topic, the Lepidoptera of Perivale Wood, species accounts of everything. So these numbers are a bit out of date now. We've continued to add species, but this is where we were in 2015, just to give a sense of the balance of species in the reserve. It is a statistically demonstrable phenomenon. Common things are more common than rare things. So perhaps unsurprisingly, common species were the most common. And that's the bulk of species we've got. These definitions of common and so on have specific meanings. I'm not going to read the meanings out at you, but basically as you go down to at least here, you're talking about things that are viewed as much rarer. So you go down to red data book, and then there's a bit of weird stuff at the bottom. So these, quite a few of these somewhat less common, but still relatively frequent species. And then moving to the national scarcities, not huge numbers there, around 28 things that are in some sense viewed as nationally scarce. We'll talk about some of them a bit later on. A few things that are called things that have just recently colonised Britain, and we haven't got our minds together and decided whether we think they're permanent residents that should have a proper status yet, or whether they might just disappear in a few years. So they get called adventive. It's a bit arbitrary. A few of them. A few species that are recorded really only as migrants in Britain. So haven't been given a national status in Britain because they don't really have a conservation status in Britain. They just turn up every so often. And a small number of species where assessments have not been made. All of these assessments are done by sort of relevant national authorities. It's not me. I'm not sitting down working out their national status. It's done by national experts studying the records, national recording schemes. But it gives you a sense, if you want, of the pattern that there's lots of common stuff. There are some of the rarer stuff that's in there. And what I'll do now, I'll call out some of the bits of species, some of the groups that might be of interest given the brief run through of the habitat of the reserve and what's there that I talked about before. It's a bit subjective, a bit arbitrary. There'll be lots of other things I could have pulled out if I'd been allowed to have 4 hours to do this talk, but as I say, Maria's told me I'm not, so I have to be good. Oh, that button didn't work. Hang on, it's not behaving. Give me a second. There we go. Sorry, just having technical challenges. So Elm Specialists, and the reason for calling this out is that elm is a species of, I've got no idea what my audience is, whether there are people who are not familiar with these things. So elm is a tree species that occurs in Britain. It's declined very significantly in the past 30, 40 or so years due to something called Dutch elm disease, a fungal disease transported by beetles that bore into the bark of the elm. And what it means is that elm trees in Britain, unless you've got one of the rare resistant ones, tend to get to about 12 years and then die. And what that's meant is that things that are dependent on elm, species that are dependent on elm, tend to have declined as well. Because if the stuff you eat has gone, it's hard to survive. So we've asked about the reserve. Well, that's, I've tried to call out, are the elm specialist species that we are seeing on the reserve, that we can record in the reserve. And there are a few. I've called out a couple of them here. On the left is a butterfly, a candling butterfly. This was one of the ones we had the drone up to see if we could survey for. And this is something called a white letter hair streak. It's a fairly small, fairly dull coloured butterfly, sort of dull brown with fairly dull brown undersides with a white line and a W. And this is a species that seemed to seriously decline along with elm. If you read the old textbooks, you read the textbooks from 30 years ago, it says the early stages, when the caterpillar first emerges from the egg, it chews down on the flowers of mature elm trees. Now, elm basically doesn't flower until it's about 15 years old. And elm basically dies because of Dutch elm disease when it gets to 12 years old. So if you live on the flowers of elm, you've got a challenge. What seems to have happened is this species is adapted, or ones that could manage this have been selected for, or something has happened, and it's now capable of feeding from day one hatching, coming out of its egg, on the leaves of elm. And that means it's managed to survive and recover. And this is a species, at least in recent years, has seen a bit of a positive upwards trend. But we've got a small colony in the reserve. There's a larger colony. They're probably part of a metapopulation and swap with each other occasionally on the site next door called Horsenden Hill, run by London Borough of Ealing. But we survey for this every year. We try to record this every year if we can. And it seems to be doing well. It seems to be expanding, but it's still a small population. So it's a challenge. The moth on the right is something called lesser spotted pinion. It does feed on elm. It's not that's its preferred food plant, but it's not absolutely exclusive to elm, so it can survive on other things, and that's probably helped it get through the times in places where there are elms there. There's a similar species called white spotted pinion. Looks very similar to the one there, but it's got a bigger white patches. That's never been recorded on the reserve, and that was never recorded on the reserve even when we had the mature elm trees back in the 1960s at the start of this survey period that I'm talking about. So we've not recorded that rare elm associate, but it's possible it was never there even when we had the habitat, even when we had the mature trees. So that's quite an interesting thing to keep an eye on, and just keep a watch out on these things. That there's no national stories going on. What does our local story look like? Well, our local story looks like we've not got vast numbers of elm specialists because we've not got vast numbers of mature elm, but we have got some of them. These are some of them. We have got a lot of elm, and one of the gentlemen I was referring to, Peter Edwards, who started doing this in the 1960s, did comment to me that because the elm grows from suckering growth, with all of the big trees having disappeared and lots of space for little ones to poke their heads up, the total leaf area of elm in the reserve might well be greater now than it was when we had the big mature elms, which is a bit of an odd thing to think of. But it does mean that some of those species have found a way to survive. Another thing the reserve is perhaps famous for is its displays of bluebells in the spring. And we have an open day every year, except this year for the tedious reason why lots of things haven't happened, where we open to anybody who wants to come to the reserve can come along and come and see the bluebells. We get thousands of people coming to this little 27-acre wood to have a look at the bluebells on this one day of the year. And it is absolutely gorgeous. It is really beautiful. You should come along if you've not to see it. If you probably can. But it caused me to ask, well, are there species that are real specialists on bluebells, and do we have them? And the short answer is there aren't actually many Lepidoptera that really specialise on bluebells. One of them that does is this rather dull, not particularly large. These divisions are millimetres on the ruler. Micromoth. It's called Iana incarna. But this is a bluebell feeding species, and we do get it in the reserve in small numbers most years. So that tells us something. It's feeding there. The other couple of species here, somewhat larger species, haven't got measurements on them, but they're probably around about 2 centimetres in length, these two. And they both feed on bluebell, but do have other food plants, are the six-striped rustic. I'm not going to read scientific names out to people. If you want to know, ask me in the chat afterwards. But six-striped rustic, which is the brown one in the middle, if you look really closely, it's got 6 stripes, because that makes it easy. And autumnal rustic, which is, there haven't been many records of that from the reserve, but 1 or 2. And both of these have bluebells in their diet, or can do, as caterpillars can feed on that. So I thought I'd call them out as things we found. But bluebells are not a major Lepidoptera food source. I must at some point talk to we've had dipterists and coleopterists do flies. We've had flies, beetles, and bugs, Heteroptera and bugs, surveyed reasonably seriously on the reserve. I must talk to those guys about whether they've found any interesting bluebell associates, but I haven't done that, and that's not the subject of today. And then Reedbed feeders. This is one of these, you have to be a lepidopterist. These really are 3 different species. They do look a bit similar. But one of the things that's happened in the reserve is the reed beds in those wetland areas have really grown, expanded, and matured in the time the survey's been going on. Back in the 1960s, there wasn't much of it. Now there's a lot of reed bed habitat relative to the size of the site. Similarly, reed beds have grown on the neighbouring sites. So these are all reed bed associated species, and they're all wainscots. They are bulrush wainscot, going from left to right, twin spotted wainscot, and brown veined wainscot. But unless you're a lepidopterist, you're going to think they're all the same moth. But those species, we record much, much more now than the guys were recording in the 60s. And that's almost certainly because we've got much, much more reedbed habitat. So as you'd expect. Very briefly onto the rarities. I said we had a couple of red data species. The question mark here tells you maybe not. So the two species that had, when I looked at this red data book species classification, for people who don't know, red data book means, in a sense, this is a high, at risk of being going extinct species. It's a high risk species, very crudely, that's what that means. And the two that we had there were on the left toad flax brocade, and on the right small ranunculus. And the reason it's got a question mark is they both have red data book species, but actually they've both become much more common in recent years. Toad flax brocade has learned to feed on one of the garden toad flaxes, so suddenly all of your gardens have become really attractive to it. It's all over the place, and we get this a lot. And it's probable when they reassess, it will lose its red data book species status. In fact, it may even have done so since I did this assessment. Species on the right, small ranunculus, feeds on prickly lettuce. It's a very weird species. It was pretty common in the 19th century. No records from our reserve, obviously, but pretty common in the 19th century. It went completely extinct in Britain. Became about 1960. It was just declared extinct in Britain. This species does not occur in Britain. 2004, I was running a trap. I think it was one in Perivale, and I found one of these, and I looked at it, I looked in the book. It's that. Well, I'm obviously wrong. I've just started doing this stuff. This book says this thing's extinct. I'm completely mad, but I'm sure it's that. So I took it off to Rachel and to Colin Plant, the county recorder. So I found one of these. I must be mad. And they said, no, you're not mad. Don't worry. It started turning up again a few years ago. We're getting more of it. So again, I suspect this will not have red data book species status in a few years' time when it's revalued. But nonetheless, we are getting this now, and we weren't getting it before. That mirrors the national trend. A couple of the national scarcities I'll briefly mention. Into the micro moths, a lot of the national scarcities are micro moths. And again, there's probably a bit of under recording story here. On the left, Distobena stevensi, and on the right, Anarcia inoxiella. There have been a few records of these. And my guess is the Anarcia inoxiella is becoming commoner. I think it's associated somewhat with peach trees, which we don't have in the reserve, but it's there. And a couple of others that I haven't got pictures of, sadly. But we've recorded other scarce ones. Christonura diversana, which was recorded in 1990. And Notocelia tetragonana, which was the first record for the county of Middlesex, which is where the old county that Perivale Wood is in. In 2004, that was the first Middlesex record of that, so that was quite nice. Some more scarcities. I'll very quickly run through these because I'm conscious of time. I'll see what these are. These are the less scarce rarities, but still quite rare. Academia decentella, top left. Top right, Dipressaria sordidatella. Bottom left is hollyhock seed moth. Bottom right is Pamina giganteana. Some more national scarcities, very briefly. Allegia similella, top left. Bit of an ancient woodland indicator. Button snout, at the top right, feeds on hop. Again, perhaps that's commoner than we think. Bottom left is Jersey tiger. Actually, that is really common in London now. You've probably, if you're London-based, you will almost certainly have seen one of these this year. And dotted chestnut on the right, which is a reasonably scarce moth still. And then finally, we're still seeing new stuff. These are just 4 of the species that have arrived in reserve comparatively recently. Top left is tree lichen beauty. Till the 2000s, this was regarded as an incredibly scarce migrant. People would, if somebody caught one of these on the south coast, people would go and visit them to have a look at the moth in a pot. It's now arrived. We think probably a combination of climate change, making the habitat a bit warmer, a bit more suitable, and a real improvement in air quality, meaning the lichens it feeds on are present. So tree lichen beauty. But top right is an unwelcome visitor. This is the box moth. if you've got box trees in your garden, this is what's trashing them, the caterpillars of this. But this has arrived, I got added to the reserve list comparatively recently. Bottom left, just to show I'm not just going to look at, I didn't even talk about this way of finding moths, but these are leaf mines, a very small caterpillar living between the top and bottom of the leaf on one of the poplar species, grey poplar. This is a species called Philocnistis xenia, which we think only arrived in Britain in about 2014, something like that, it might have been 2012. And I think I recorded this for the first time in the reserve in 2017. I've had a look this year and not found it yet, so I'm a little bit annoyed. And finally, the bottom right, arguably the rarest moth we've recorded. This is a species called Praise peregrina, and its history is rather odd. The type specimen of this, the first time it was ever seen and described in the world, was a specimen just over Wood, about a mile away, actually in my back garden. And it's a weird species. It's only been recorded from Britain. We really don't think it is a native British species, because it would have been recorded before. There's enough naturalists in Britain, it would have been recorded before. It has now been found feeding on its food plant, so it feeds on ruta, ruse, which again, there is a native recurring rue in Britain, although the one it's been found on is a rue that grows in the Mediterranean. So no one knows where this thing's native to. No one knows where it's from. It's been found in no other country than Britain, but we're pretty sure it's not British. And we've had a scattering of records. Very weird, a very strange thing to have. So brief acknowledgements, and then I'll hand back to Maria to host any questions if I haven't bored people into submission by now. To the Selborne Society for letting me record there. It's a real privilege to have a site that you can go to and record pretty safely in London. Thanks to particularly Rachel Terry and Colin Plant, who've helped with a lot of ID problems. I am still learning. Without their help, a lot of these things would have been unrecorded. And thanks to, I've called some of the more active recorders who come and help me out, or come and moth with me. They don't really help me out because it's not that I'm better than them. They're as good at recording as me, but come and do a lot of recording with me. Andrew Culshaw, Fiona Barkley, Max Whitby, Neil Anderson, Peter Edwards, Barbara Mulligan, and loads of others who I'm not going to list who've recorded their. So thanks everyone. I hope that was interesting enough, and I'll hand back to Maria and I'll stop sharing and put my screen on.
Thank you ever so much, David. I thought that was fascinating and really entertaining as well. Thank you ever so much. I'm sure there will be questions from people. I think Kieran's asking people to do a poll. Do you want to say something about that, Kieran? Oh yeah, right, there's a little poll. So we just want to get a sense about how many people are currently LNHS members, or people that maybe, used to be members or have never been, just to get a bit of a sense about the audience. That would be really helpful. Thank you very much. So
we can't track it.
Well, it's anonymous as well, so we can't see who's put what. So don't worry.
Yeah, no, yeah. It's you can put what you like, but it's just useful for us to get a bit of a sense about the audience, because this is the first time we've done it, and we don't know whether we're largely attracting LHS members, which is fine, or whether other people are coming along as well. But it would just be helpful to us. So thank you for that. So just a reminder about asking questions. You can type a question into the chat box if you would like to do that, or the other option is you've got a virtual hand that you can raise, and you can put that up, and I'm keeping a lookout for those, and then you can ask your question. We can unmute yourself, and you can ask your question in person. So please, if you've got things that you'd like to ask, use one of those two options. I've got a couple of things to ask. David, are you able to answer a couple of things?
Yeah,
okay, yep. Okay, so if I'll kick off, and then I can't see anyone's hand raised at the moment, but don't be shy.
Max is raising a non-virtual hand, as is
okay.
someone
that's fine.
on.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So Max, if you want to unmute yourself, you should be able to do that. Is that?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's fine.
Very good. Oh, well, didn't you want to ask a question first?
No, please, after you. That's fine.
Well, that's very kind. It was a marvelous presentation, David. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you a completely unscientific question, I'm afraid, but it might be of interest to people. What is the moth when we trap it with good fortune at Perivale that warms the cockles of your heart most in the year?
So there's probably two. I'm going to cheat and give two answers to that. One of them, I'll tell you briefly why as well. One of them is one called the blotched emerald. And I slightly arbitrarily, when I was first venturing onto Twitter, chose an anonymous name by naming my Twitter handle after the first moth I'd seen when I was setting up Twitter. So I called myself Blotched Emerald. And it's sort of grown on me over the years on Twitter. So now whenever I see it, it sort of feels, oh, that's my moth. Even though it's completely arbitrary. It is a bit of an ancient woodland indicator. It's quite a nice species. It's quite attractive, but that's one. The other one I really like is Asperia sulphurella. It's a micro moth. It's a really attractive thing, subtle yellow, golden stripes. And I sort of fell in love with it when I early on was trapping and took a picture of it, and I just really liked the photograph I took. And I just thought, that looks really gorgeous. And it's been my desktop wallpaper on my computer for about 15 years now. So every time I see that, I sort of feel, yay.
Very good. It's worth, I think, mentioning this.
Oh yes, yes.
You should describe it, but I should say I've got nothing to do with publishing it, but I wish I had. But it's the most marvelous, marvelous book.
Yeah. When I said hopefully people will be doing more caterpillar recording, that book. But for some Bloomsbury's the publisher. It's called Field Guide to Caterpillars of Great Britain and Ireland. Well worth your money.
Who's the author of that?
It's I've got a copy here. Hang on. It's Barry Henwood and Phil Sterling with illustrations by the excellent Richard Lewington.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Someone on the account labelled Liz Andrew, but I don't think it's Liz, was raising a hand.
Yes, yeah.
It's Kennedy Crookland. I'm Liz's husband. I wanted to ask you, if I may, about, after your splendid talk, about the differences in species that you attract by the two different types of trap, the UV one and the more traditional bright light wide mouth one.
It's a good question. And I'll say I've not done, well, certainly the LED one I've not done any analysis of, because I've only been using that for about a year. So that one is, I wouldn't say subjectively it's finding me anything different. It's finding similar species. It's lower powered, so it's finding them in lower numbers. But the advantage of it is it's really, really light. And it's powered off standard D-cell batteries. So the one you can see behind me in my virtual background, literally I could pack in the bottom of my bag if I was going somewhere, grab a cardboard box when I got there and create a moth trap, which is a lot easier than taking the other things. There is perhaps a bit of a difference that maybe some of the blue light traps I think are a bit better at attracting micro moths, and probably a bit better at attracting some of the winter flying species as well. I often find in winter that my lower powered blue light traps are doing as well as the much more powerful mains powered bright white light traps. But it's a bit subjective. I haven't done any rigorous analysis of it.
Thank you. Tony Madwick, you've done your virtual hand. Would you like to ask your question?
I managed to find that to work quite well. David, that was an excellent talk. Thanks very much for that. Quick question really about your raising of pupae and hatching them out. What proportions are you actually collecting? And of those, what proportions are demonstrating parasitism?
That's a good question. So again, not robust statistical analysis. Generally, if I find a caterpillar and don't know what it is, I will keep it and rear it on. But I'm not brilliant at I don't go out and really actively beat the bushes for caterpillars in a way that I kind of should, actually, if I want to do this properly. So it's casual finding, but almost I'm keeping close to 100% of what I find, but I'm only finding them casually. and that tells you how good I am at identifying larvae, of course. With the new book, I hope I'll be able to identify more and not need to keep them. Parasitism, I would say about 50% of what I capture get through to adulthood in some way. So if you define parasites broadly to include bacteria and viruses, probably around half have something. I have raised on, from a caterpillar that I'd identified, some parasitic wasps, and I've passed them on to a gentleman from Scotland whose name I'm embarrassed to say I've forgotten, who does them. So we have got 1 or 2 identified parasitic wasp species that I've reared from things in the reserve, which is getting into stuff that's seriously under-recorded. So Cotesia fella, I know we've recorded from not grass caterpillars.
I mean, that's really this game, because we under-record ichneumons and some of the parasitic flies a lot.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, it's a bit of a shame.
Yeah.
And Perivale Woods, is it quite isolated from surrounding areas? Is it a pocket, or are there clear migratory routes or transect routes through?
So it is fairly embedded in suburbia. There is a site next to it, which is several times bigger, run by London Borough of Ealing, called Horsenden Hill, which is also ancient woodland, some very good grassland. That's much more open to the public, has much more pressure, but Ealing and the ranger team do a really good job of managing that, and I've got a huge amount of respect for them. Really, really well done. So it's got that linkage, but then that unit itself is surrounded largely by housing in suburbia. We have got the canal on one side, which is obviously a corridor. We've got the railway on the other, which is a corridor. But there is a bit of me does think there's a bit of island ecology going on here.
Yep, thank you. Okay, we're going to take a couple of questions from the chat, and then David will come to you afterwards. So Kieran, are you okay to do the chat questions?
Yeah, so we've got one quick one from Julie, who's asked when Perivale Wood is open to visitors. Mm-hmm. And she's followed that up after I've responded with, is it just 1 day a year? So
okay, so very brief. So strictly to general members of the public, yes, it's 1 day a year. And it's possibly non-days this year, although I think we are thinking about, can we do something, because we failed to let people in because of getting 2,000 people into a reserve that size when you want to keep 2 minutes apart was impossible. But members of the Selborne Society, which you can join for a very reasonable, I'm going to get in trouble if I get this wrong, Sarah will shout at me, I think it's £10 a year for an individual, can gain access, again in normal circumstances, can gain access with a fair degree of whenever they want. And certainly members who do sort of serious surveying work for us, we tend to just issue them a key and they can literally come in whenever they want. But that does tend to be people who are doing slightly more serious work. So there's ways to gain access. Membership of the society is the best way. I think Sarah's put a link to our website in the chat, so you can join through that.
Yeah, and another quick question from Fiona is, what species might you expect next?
What species might I expect next? That's always hard. It's going to jinx it if I answer that. I'm telling you what has been expanding recently that we've not seen. Well, I'm going to be optimistic and say that since I'm going to be doing a lot more pheromone surveying, having been successful, I think next red-belted clearwing might be what I get next. But that's just because I'm trying to be optimistic for the weekend. In terms of climate change, I think what I might get next, butterfly, maybe to be optimistic, I think there could be a small population of purple emperor butterfly around Horsenden and Perivale. They're really hard to find in low populations, and although we've looked a lot, again, that's another one I'd be optimistic to find.
David, did you want to ask a question as well? David Bevan?
Are you talking to me? Yes, I had a question. First of all, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Quite terrifying, the technology, and the fact that I've managed to get onto it is amazing. Yeah. It's only been achieved through my 2 daughters. I just wanted to ask a very, very quick question. Do you have alder buckthorn in Perivale Wood? And if you don't, would it be good to plant it? For instance.
So Nick will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the answer is no. Nick isn't pulling an alarmed face on the video, so I think I don't think we do have alder buckthorn. Alder buckthorn, of course, is the food plant for brimstone butterfly. We do have brimstone butterfly pretty commonly. We have tended to take a view that we don't introduce things to the reserve.
Good.
Even if they are native species that it could be appropriate to have there.
Just to add to that, David, we don't have it in the reserve, you're quite right, but it was planted adjacent to the reserve in the Royal Mail Bund that runs on the west side of the reserve. I don't know if the alder buckthorn is still there, but it certainly was planted back in around 2000.
Excellent. I might go and have a look, although since my botanical skills are embarrassingly poor, I may fail to identify it. I'm pretty sure it also occurs in some of the gardens in the area around.
Thank you, David. Very helpful.
Do we have time for one last question, Maria?
Yeah, we've just fit one. It is 7:30, but yeah, one last question will be fine if David's okay with that.
Okay, so Brenna has just asked. It's quite a long comment, so I'm just going to read the last part of the question.
Yeah.
Do you believe that climate change will have a positive or negative medium-term outlook for Lepidoptera in Perivale Wood?
In the reserve, and this is a controversial thing to say, I think, and probably in southern Britain more generally, climate change will generally increase our Lepidoptera biodiversity. More species are not quite able to survive here because it's not warm enough, and will probably start to colonize as it gets warmer. Globally, in the medium term, I think it's got to be negative because some species will be driven extinct globally. And if you were asking me about if I was in the Highlands of Scotland, almost certainly I would be expected to lose species because some of the mountain species that need the cold get pushed up and up the mountain, and eventually there's only so high you can go. Once you've got a species that can only survive on the very peak of Ben Nevis, it's in trouble if it needs to go another few meters, and we will lose some of those species. Very briefly, I'll mention, it wasn't in the talk, but a species that perhaps familiar with called the garden tiger. It's very big, very showy moth. Actually, very few records from Perivale Wood ever, but the records are from the 1960s. Is one of the few species where they are pretty confident that climate change is the reason for its significant decline. It's quite a subtle story. It's to do with January is getting warmer, so the caterpillars metabolize the chemicals they use to get through the winter and survive sub-zero temperatures, but February is not having got warmer. So they metabolize these chemicals in January because they think, oh, it's getting warm now, winter's over, time to put the energy to better use. And then you get a vicious snap in February, which we do most years. And they're pretty confident that's what's killed this species off. That shift in. It's quite, but where things are driven out by climate change is going to be subtle stories like that. It's not in the main going to be, it's got too warm for them, they've died. It's going to be weird little interactions and really hard to prove. That's probably enough on climate change.
Yeah. That's a really interesting example to end on, though, to just show how kind of complex and difficult to unpick sometimes these changes are. A good example of where it's not obvious the impact, but clearly, over a period of time, there is likely to be an impact. So it's time for us to wrap up now. I just want to say again, a really big warm thank you to David. That's just been an excellent talk. I hope people have, thank you. We've got some virtual clapping. That's brilliant. So I hope everybody has